In this lecture, I want to talk about life history. Life history is something that we can talk about as a characteristic of an organism, or sometimes we refer to a whole species' life history. Well, what is life history? Well, like it says here, it talks about this record of events, and basically what you do when you think about the life history for a particular organism or a species is to think about all those events that affect the growth, development, reproduction, and survival of a particular individual or species, as I mentioned. And so there are a number of different what we call life history traits. So if you're going to chronicle these kinds of events, we want to look at things like how old are you and how big are you when you reach sexual maturity, if you're talking about a sexually reproducing species. How much reproduction is there? How many offspring does one produce? How early or how late in the life cycle does an organism reproduce? And what are the rates of survival for the offspring and for the individual? So all of these are examples of the major life history traits. As you might imagine, there's a fair amount of diversity in life history styles for different species. So the life history of this wolf spider here, this female with a bunch of babies on her back, probably differs from the life history of this rhinoceros. And there are different kinds of patterns that you see. Like, should you produce a whole bunch of offspring really early on in your life? Or should you wait till you get older and just have one baby that you might take care of very well? Those are the kinds of trade-offs that species often face. As I've mentioned, there's a large diversity of life history strategies that organisms may be involved in. And one that's particularly interesting is something called sequential hermaphroditism. And again, this is kind of an unusual life history strategy, and I'm just kind of bringing it up as an example of the fact that not all species do things the same way. In the stoplight parrotfish, for example, these organisms kind of start their life out as female, and this is a female fish at the top in the top picture here. But later on, many females may eventually transition to becoming a male. Now, they don't all do that, but all of the individuals in a group start out as female, and then usually the one that matures the quickest becomes the male. And then that particular male will end up guarding a harem of females, and he gets to fertilize the eggs of those females. And if for some reason he dies, or an experimenter kind of removes him from the group, the next largest female will begin to immediately transition to male. So the ovaries and other female reproductive organs will just start to disintegrate, and then they'll redevelop into testes and other male organs. So that's a really pretty interesting example of an unusual life history strategy. Species that do this are called protogynous, which literally means female first. And there also are some protoandrous fish, which means male first. So coral reef parrotfish may be kind of unusual, but in general, we can certainly examine the life history strategy of a particular species. And by that, what we mean is that we really want to look at the patterns that they use in timing. It's a lot about timing. And if you think about sort of life history as a budget, like how do you divide your time and your energy? So we're talking about time and energy, really. How do you divide both time and energy between growth, reproduction, and survival? Remember in class, we talked about the fact that the three major ecological parameters of incredible importance that we want to always focus on and think about are growth, reproduction, and survival. If you put a ton of energy into growing, okay, you have less energy available for reproducing and just surviving. If you put a lot of energy into reproducing, you may not be able to put as much energy into worrying about just basic survival, okay? So how do different organisms or different species budget or allocate? And that word allocation, how do we allocate, or how do individuals allocate their energy and time, okay, between these three major ecological parameters? And again, we're talking about growth, reproduction, and survival. How do we allocate, or how do organisms allocate time and energy between these three major ecological parameters? That is what we mean by a life history strategy. This diagram just illustrates what I was talking about for this frog here. How large should I grow? When should I begin reproducing? How many offspring? And what size should each be? How big should each egg be? Should I produce a whole lot of little eggs, or should I produce a few bigger eggs? How fast might these eggs grow and develop? At what point do they metamorphose from tadpole into adult? Okay, and around and around. And then over here, how often to breed? Should you care for your offspring or let them go off on their own? These are all really important examples of ecological questions that ecologists face and ask. And of course, we can answer them in a variety of ways using our evolutionary perspective. Remember that when we talked about evolution and we talked about phenotypic traits in particular, that phenotypes are a combination of genes and environment, right? All phenotypes include a combination of genetic factors and environmental factors that contribute to the expression of a phenotype for an individual. So what's true of populations is that individuals within a population or a species show variation, right? And of course, this is what is the basis for evolutionary change within populations. But individuals within species show variations in many characters, but in particular, they show variation in life history traits because of these differences in genes and environmental influences. Okay, and so for any one particular species, there can be different degrees of what we call phenotypic plasticity, meaning how different would the phenotypes among individuals of a single species be? Okay, so let's think about that frog species that we were just looking at. If you had 50 or 100 frogs of the same species, maybe even born in the same year, how different is one individual from the next? Okay, and so different individuals may differ depending on a variety of different kinds of environmental influences. Okay, so if you have a single genotype, let's say you have a particular species that produces genetic clones even, a single genotype can still produce a number of different phenotypes given differences in the environment, okay? So for certain species, environmental influences on the phenotype may be really strong, and in other species, environmental influences on the phenotype may be relatively weaker, okay? So the degree of phenotypic plasticity here may be high or it may be low, depending on the organism. And we're going to talk a little bit more about examples of how the phenotype for even a genetically identical individual, how the phenotype can vary. Let's look at an example of a species here, these ponderosa pines, which are beautiful trees that grow primarily in the West. And what these graphs show is that for many different kinds of traits, there can be quite a bit of plasticity in phenotypic expression. So as you might expect, even if we have genetic clones, okay, genetically identical seeds that grow into individual trees, if those particular seeds are planted in different conditions or happen to grow in different conditions naturally, we see differences depending on the kinds of environmental influences that they've been under. So here we can see in the blue lines here are for cool, moist climates on both graphs, okay? And the red line is for those trees living in a desert kind of climate. So two different sets of environmental circumstances. And we can look at these ecological factors of leaf mass on the left or height of the tree on the right. And for either one, again, even for genetically identical individuals, for those individuals that have been living in a cooler, moister climate, they have a greater degree of leaf mass, even relative to trunk diameter, right? And a greater height relative to trunk diameter over the range of different trunk diameters. So there's a greater amount of leaf mass and height for those individuals that have been growing and living in a cooler, moister climate compared to those that live in the desert. Again, even if they're genetically identical. And so this is exactly what we mean by phenotypic plasticity. Each phenotype, each tree is different depending on its environmental circumstances. So in ponderosa pines, the range of phenotypic plasticity involves a very continuous range of sizes, very continuous degree of plasticity. And as we're going to see, there are species that have more discrete shifts in plasticity. For example, the spadefoot toad tadpoles here illustrate the fact that you can have very discrete morphs given different environmental circumstances, meaning they're kind of one thing or another. And this kind of relates to what we talked earlier about data, continuous and discrete data. So discrete meaning very separate kinds of forms. And for these tadpoles here, there's two different morph types. There's the omnivore morph and there's a carnivore morph. Okay, and whether or not a spadefoot tadpole develops into this type of morph depends on its environmental circumstances. Okay, in particular, it depends on the food supply. Okay, and so omnivores are going to be favored in those ponds that persist, that stay around for a long time, because the individuals will metamorphosize in better condition and have a better chance of survival. Okay, but in those ponds that dry up quick, right, these temporary, these ephemeral ponds that many amphibians find themselves in, if they dry up really quick, and that means that the food supply is going to run out pretty fast, right? And then it's going to be every tadpole for himself. What happens is these guys start to eat each other, right? And so those organisms that grow faster will start to eat the other tadpoles around them, and they basically metamorphize into this carnivore morph where they're eating their siblings or other tadpoles around them from offspring of other individuals. And so they can grow up quickly and they can develop really fast before that pond completely dries up. So they have to be able to metamorphize into an adult before the pond is gone. Okay, so remember that it's this environmental circumstance of how long is the pond going to be around, providing the proper amount of food over the course of a season so that you can just hang out and eat algae and maybe bits of food that are around, maybe dead siblings if they happen to die. Or if you're in a hurry, you better metamorphize into this monstrous carnivore and start eating the other tadpoles around you. Okay, so again, two different morphs from genetically identical individuals. Okay, so you can take the same eggs from the same individual, okay, and the offspring may develop into these discrete morph types depending, again, on these environmental circumstances.